Hello and welcome to week 2 of our MOOC, English as a Medium of Instruction for Academics. I'm Mary, I think, and I believe this is Rob.
Yes, I don't have to say anything. Please continue.
Thank you for all the work that you've been doing over the last week. It's really great to see people participating and making suggestions and really making our course come to life for everybody. So thank you very, very much indeed. We had some lovely comments, lovely suggestions. I've learnt now to say Luciana, as in cinnamon. So, you know, there's lots of interesting things going on and we're learning such a lot about you and from you at the same time. I think I would like to talk about Eduardo and thank Eduardo in Mexico, especially for the length of his comments and the frequency of his comments. And if you haven't been reading what Eduardo has to say, do please read Eduardo's comments because he opens up a wide variety of issues around EMI.
As do other people, we should add.
As do other people as well, yes. But he really gets a gold star for the amount of work he's done for us all in this last week. He mentions the difficulty of speaking to faceless people. This is something we did touch on last week. And it is strange to be expressing your opinions to an audience that you can't see. And Eduardo would appreciate it very much indeed. And I think it's a good point that he makes. If you could put a little photograph up as your profile, so that there is a face there to react to. I think it's really nice.
Or if you want to be modern, you could have a flower or something that represents you, because some people don't like to put their faces on things.
Some people don't like to put their faces.
But
some people don't like
an orange
talking to
square isn't,
yeah, exactly.
isn't very attractive to talk to, is it?
Some people don't like avatars, but if you wanted to go down that route, that would be better than the orange square.
Very modern, isn't it?
Very modern. Yes, we are very modern. And he said it makes communication easier. Students don't wear masks in class, and I thought that was a nice way of expressing this idea. And I know that you've got a lot to say in response to Eduardo, amongst others. So would you like to perhaps pick up on one of Eduardo's points here?
One of Eduardo's points, yes, certainly. So one thing I found interesting this week was the way that a simple question brings up lots of different answers. And I think part of the design of this course is to get people talking, because the knowledge is among you, not really to be given by us. And some really good examples were the think and feel discussions, where, to be honest, in terms of EMI instruction, whether you choose the word think or feel is not going to solve many problems.
No.
But it brought up lots of things, because everybody is right, but they're saying different things. So you've got, for example, Elizabeth and Luciana, who said context gives the meaning of a word. And I absolutely agree with that. You can't say, you know, in your discipline, when we look at communication, like language is looking at some part of communication that's decontextualized. What we talk about when we talk about EMI is communication. And words do not have meanings unless that word is understood to have the same meaning. So absolutely, the meaning of a word is entirely in the context and in whether the other person understands what you intended. And think and feel, at times, you know, the meaning can shift depending on how you say it and what you're saying.
And also the person who says it as well. You know, their particular preferences. I know that I possibly use the word I feel quite a lot, which may indicate something about me as a person. I don't know, I'm not going into deep psychology here, but I know
we could analyse your psychology if you'd like, no.
But I do know that I say I feel, and my feeling is. So that's just me. Really. But then a lot of the time I just say I think, as many people do.
Yeah.
But it is interesting.
And that links to Eduardo's point. So Eduardo said essentially they are the same. You know, they have their colloquial uses. They are the same. Be yourself.
Be yourself, yes.
So if you...
Absolutely.
And often there is research on EMI that shows when people focus too hard on their language, it can have a detrimental effect on their teaching because they're focusing on what they're saying and not thinking about what's being understood or how they're saying it.
Exactly.
And
it can be a barrier to your passion for your teaching as well. Because in being yourself, you know, you've chosen to teach a particular, in a particular discipline, a particular topic. And, you know, there must be a reason for that. And normally one would hope it's because you really care about that subject. It's something you want to impart to others and to bring about a love in other people for this topic. And that passion has to come across, and the language mustn't stop that passion coming across, because you are conveying so much through that enthusiasm for the subjects.
And speaking of, enthusiasm for subjects.
Yes.
In school, I didn't have a lot of enthusiasm for physics, but
no.
but we appreciate the physicists who are here. Leandro is a physicist, and he made the point that, there is a difference in physics. You know, if you talked about feeling, it might come across as a bit strange, perhaps, for certain context. And he talked about sort of the difference between cognition and emotion. So the words do have a different connotation potentially. So again, it's just one tiny difference, but you can see the context, the ontology, so the way you think about knowledge in the field. You might think knowledge is related to how you feel, for example, in education. Other people might say knowledge is about cognitive differentiation. And so we've got this, this small question that brings up a lot of answers which are all true. And likewise, I thought the examples of lectures were very interesting.
Very.
And what you identified was different qualities of EMI lectures, or what could be EMI lectures. So Eduardo, again, thank you, Eduardo, from me as well. It's very interesting conversations. So Eduardo picked out Chomsky. And
I think he's your hero, isn't he?
Yes.
Yes.
Not mine.
But Eduardo's, yes.
Yeah. Nothing against Chomsky, but anyway. So he picked out the fact that, you know, Chomsky delivers his message. He delivers it as Chomsky. He's kind of wise, he's clear, he's engaging with the audience. It's not about flashy TED Talk deliveries. John mentioned that his video is, the speaker is funny and accessible. So so he noticed the personality and how that would be received by the audience. Liliana and Volha, I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly, mentioned that the content of their lectures would be important for the students. So they're looking at the content and how important that is, and the fact that it's clear for students as well, which is always important. Joanna, Derek and Olga looked at the qualities of the speaker. And again, I love this because this is what education is about. It's holistic. It's not about how do you do this in a mechanical way and make everybody the same. It's about what qualities does the speaker have, like, I like that person, I'm entertained by that person, I trust that person, going back to Chomsky, I trust that that person is giving me the knowledge and is worth my attention. And that's a quality that we can't exactly identify as if you do this and this and this, you will get this outcome, because it's really dependent on who you are, what's your natural style. And then Christina mentioned a very important point, which is her video is concise. And she said that gives you an opportunity to do other things in your class. And that's a very important thing with EMI. Some people think when they hear, I have to teach through English, as a medium of instruction, you have to talk all the time at your students. And really, this is not what it means. You know, you have to engage them, you have to educate. And Christina quite rightly says that maybe that means, especially if you've got a mixture of language backgrounds in your class, maybe that means reducing your talking time and engaging them in other practices, like hands-on activities. So there we go.
This actually leads into a number of issues that came up with the scenarios towards the end of this week with lower level learners, students whose English you perceive as being better than yours. And the solution very often lies not in the language, but in the pedagogy. So picking up on Rod's point that, you know, it's not talking at students all the time in English, it's managing that classroom scenario and using all the skills, the ideas, the strategies that you've accumulated over your years of teaching in order to make it an interesting and vibrant experience for everybody, and kind of taking a little bit of the pressure off yourself. There have been, you know, quite a few comments on this idea like the students have better English than I do. I would like to ask, if that's what you feel, I would like to ask you, in what ways is the students' English better than yours? It could be because a lot of young people have travelled a lot nowadays. It could be, you know, that through travel and exposure to English and American, etc. culture, that they've got this kind of, not exactly fake fluency, but an air of being fluent and comfortable in the language. That possibly some of us who were born a lot longer ago than they were, you know, haven't had the opportunity to acquire. And I feel that sometimes when you actually get down to the subject matter of the lesson, of the lecture, then things fall apart because you have the knowledge, the content knowledge, you have years of knowledge, you are a specialist, an expert in this subject. You're also an expert in pedagogical issues. You have the vocabulary, the terminology, you know how to talk about your subject, which, you know, the students might not be able to do. They might not be able to transfer some of this fluency to the actual EMI situation. So that's something to bear in mind. And then acknowledging students' fluency in the language is another way of managing, of coping. You know, how can you use these very fluent students to help weaker ones? Can you ask them to present something in the classroom or do something that will acknowledge their fluency, give them some responsibility, some status, and also take a little bit of the pressure off you. So, you know, this EMI lecture or lesson or session, whatever you're going to call it, you know, isn't, coming back to what Rob was saying, isn't you talking all the time. It's very varied and we hope energetic and interesting experience for everybody. So use your pedagogical skills.
And I'll add as well, just from my own experience this week, I've been marking a lot.
But everybody's marking. Oh.
But yeah, so we talked about native speakers this week, but lots of the people joining this MOOC won't have experience of teaching many native speaker students, but it's exactly the same for them. Lots of the first years I'm marking don't have the ways of expressing content knowledge that the third years do. And the third years have developed this way of writing and way of communicating that is conceptual and sort of reflective. And often the first years can't put those two together. So it's not just something about English proficiency, meaning, as you say, this kind of fluency and the confidence that you have in chatting with other people. It's specifically about how you communicate content, knowledge, and the language of learning and developing your knowledge, which is something that everybody has to do in a university environment. So yeah, I'll just add that.
It's surprising, you know, that the non-native English speakers assume that the native English speakers can write in academic English and can perform in academic English situations when they can't. We should never make that assumption.
We shouldn't say they can't, but
well,
some of them can. But
some of them can, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, where are we with our lists then.
With our lists.
With our lists. Couple of questions. Barbara Wright, at one point, and I think this was in 1.20, the references and extended reading, said, "I need some help here, please." And she didn't say anything else. So Barbara, can you get back to us and just tell us what help it is that you need with that? And then Volha wants some more about working out an EMI program. Now, I didn't quite understand whether you meant like a training program for your colleagues. Do you want to actually put on an EMI training program for your colleagues, or is it something else? So once again, if you can get back to us, then we can try and answer that question for you. All right? Yeah.
Yes.
So,
yes.
where
so
are
the
we
other,
with your list and my list?
So I will just add my three other people I was going to mention.
Okay.
Interesting things. So Joanna mentioned about planning and staging her classes, but very important point, she said, but I do that anyway. So absolutely.
Brilliant.
So we're not looking necessarily for an EMI methodology to be different from what you do, but maybe it involves being more explicit and having more empathy for your students who might not be following the structure that you have.
Yes.
So again, it's often about engaging with the principles you already know, but just making it clearer. So that's really important.
And if I can interrupt, Eduardo made the same point about it's preparation for the class, isn't it? And this is just good practice, and it's like more so in the EMI context. Preparing specifically with perhaps the weaker students in mind. What do they need in order to be able to follow your session?
Yeah.
So any materials that you can give beforehand for them to read. Eduardo mentioned a handbook, perhaps for terminology, to provide a glossary of terms. Just thinking ahead, what will my students need in order to follow my session really well, and in particular the weaker ones, what extra supports can I put in there for them? And it's just good practice, really.
We mentioned EMI. Some people have also mentioned, in previous runs, having teaching perhaps in Portuguese in Brazil, but having international students, and it's exactly the same thing, because they might not be following Portuguese the way that you would speak it. So, it's essentially about communicating to an international audience.
Yes.
The other thing, quote of the week for me, Eduardo again. He had this phrase, "I dance according to the rhythm being played."
Oh,
and that's
lovely.
like emphasizing the compromise we all have to make. We have to do what we have to do, and we have to dance along with it, with some criticality.
Yeah, and some dances are more difficult than others.
They are.
We can discuss this ad infinitum. But yes, and some of us are better dancers than others.
Yeah. And that
I won't ask you about your dancing skills, Rob. But
terrible, but thank you for asking. Okay. And that links to what Carol said. So what if teachers, or what can teachers do learning all that's on the MOOC, but they go back and, for example, they are in an English-only environment? Well, I think we develop knowledge of why the students might be struggling, why multilingualism might be a better approach than English-only. But then if we have that knowledge, then we can apply more criticality to our teaching, and we can communicate to students while understanding the difficulties they're having, and perhaps give them an outlet or a suggestion as to where they can incorporate their first language knowledge with what they're learning. So again, I think it's useful to learn about things even if you can't implement them. And finally, I just say, Eduardo, his advice, I like the idea of bonding with your students being the most important thing. A bit like what he said earlier about Chomsky, it's about believing in that person, trusting that person, and building a positive relationship, which is fundamental to education. Being yourself, but he also said being calm. So if you're not calm, can you be yourself? But we won't go into that too much. But so being yourself is really important. Don't take on things that don't suit your teaching methods or your natural way of behaving, because that can be a disaster, unless you really need to. And yes, so that's essentially the areas I wanted to discuss. The other thing with speaking and writing, We talked about lots of
Yeah.
differences, but I was going to mention as well, in some disciplines, it's expected that a speaker will read, or at least have their paper in front of them and deliver their paper. So I wanted to add a word of caution that this is always contextual advice, and it does depend to some degree where you are and what you're teaching, because there is no one best practice, because the audience come with an expectation. And if that expectation is to listen to someone deliver a paper, like in philosophy, we have lots of people who do that, then perhaps giving an engaging visual PowerPoint might make all the philosophers in the room just look down on you like you're not intelligent enough to talk to them. But yes. And thank you very much again. Everyone is having very interesting conversations and it's really engaging, so thank you.
Yeah. I think the only thing I wanted to add really from the discussions this week is we've talked about knowing ourselves in order to be able to deliver in the best possible way in the context that we find ourselves, but also getting to know our students as best we can. And I know this is really difficult when some of us have really large classes to teach, so we're asking for the impossible. But perhaps you can do needs analyses before a course starts or at the beginning of a course to get a snapshot, a flavour of a class. And if you do have a smaller group, then you can get to know the individuals better and then use the skills and the personalities of the students, use them to your advantage, use them strategically to make the experience a good one for everybody. And I did want to mention as well, and I think it's worth just pointing out because it happens anyway, students sometimes ask if they can record our lectures, and sometimes if you say no, they do it anyway because they've got their phone under the desk. If you feel okay about recording your lectures and uploading a recording to an online site or something, that's brilliant. That will really help the weaker students because I know it sounds silly, but when people are speaking, you can't see the words. You can't rewind and listen to words that have just flown by. So with students that are weaker, any possibility to record your lecture, whether you do it like more formally or allow students to capture what you're saying on their phone, if you're okay with that, I would say that can really help students. But it is something to talk about, negotiate and so on, so that everybody feels comfortable. Because it doesn't appeal to some people, and we have to respect that, don't we?
In most supervision meetings I have these days, the students ask me if they can record it.
Yes.
Because they want to go back and
they can't
work out what on earth am I saying.
But they can't capture everything. They can't write everything down quickly enough. Whereas with a book, when you're reading, you are in control. You can go back. You can reread as often as you want to. But you haven't got that feeling of control when you're listening. So to hand that back to the students is quite empowering for them. Makes them feel better very often. Okay. I think we need to start talking about next week, don't we?
We do. Exciting.
Week. Very exciting. We are going to be live. Now this will be next Thursday, the 20th of June, and it will be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and that is UK time. And we are on summer time at the moment. You'd never believe it. It is actually pouring with rain at the moment here in Southampton. It is nominally summer time. So that's 3 p.m. British summer time. So it would be lovely if some of you could actually be with us live together. And what we mean by that is you can go to our Facebook group, and I don't know if we've talked about the Facebook group, have we?
No.
We'll mention that again in a moment. And also the step on week 3 of this course, of this MOOC, where you can either beforehand post questions or during the discussion post questions. So we can actually have a screen here and we can see any questions that you want to post during our discussion. So it's really quite exciting, really feeling contact with you when this happens. So that's the live session, and then there's the Facebook group. I don't know if we have mentioned it. I don't think we haven't. We have we? I can't remember. I've got a
don't think
terrible
we
memory.
have.
I don't
We
think
have a
we have.
Facebook
We
group.
have a
That's the
Facebook
key
group.
point. Yeah.
And the title is the same as the MOOC. So English as a Medium of Instruction for Academics. You're very, very welcome to join us. We have over 300 people in our group, and it is a way of, keeping the group together, people who've been with us on past runs, and you are very, very welcome to join us. I know Facebook doesn't appeal to everybody. Not everybody can get it, not everybody likes it, but it is one way of staying together after the course is finished. So for that reason, we opened it up. Okay. Is there anything else of a practical nature we need to say, Rob?
Not that I can think of.
No.
We can, if you have any questions, as always, please post them on this step.
Yeah.
And if you have any questions for the live session, post them on that step in week 3.
Yes.
And then we can solve anything left unsaid.
We can?
Well, no, probably not. But let's say that.
Yes,
That's what teachers say, isn't it?
That's what teachers say,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, okay then. I think we'd better say goodbye now.
Yes. Thank you for watching. Again, if you managed to stay with us to the end. Thank you very much.
And see you live next week.
Live next week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.